In this lecture I want to talk about a third way in which adaptation is occurring in the Pacific, and it's a way that occurs almost independently of policy, and it's a very effective means by which adaptation can happen, and it's been going on since the first people sailed across the Pacific and arrived on an island. And it's the use of population mobility and the benefits that it confers for adaptation to climate change. So you may remember the lecture I gave last week about the problems of thinking about climate change as forcing migration in the Pacific Islands. Now, what I'm going to do today is change the thinking around this issue to being something quite different and seeing not migration, but rather more focusing on mobility. It's a slightly different idea and the opportunities that presents. So migration is an idea, or when we use the word migration, it typically confers a notion of people crossing an international border and moving permanently and staying. And it's an idea that is talked about mostly in developed countries, in the rich countries of the world, who have anxieties about people crossing and staying in their borders. Now, in a world before there were countries and before there were borders and there were countries that were protecting their sovereignty, people moved around. Indeed, our earliest ancestors were hunter-gatherers, they moved around. Mobility is in fact as old as the species, and it's always been a way in which people have managed to deal with variability and changing conditions. So mobility is a different idea. It's about the idea of movement, that people are actually often always moving, and as they move they take with them their cultures, their ideas, and they're exchanging things across their social networks which are expanding over space. This is the idea of mobility. So in thinking about mobility and adaptation, we're trying to shift the picture from thinking big geopolitical picture about forced migration across states, which is a theoretical problem rather more than an actual problem, at least in association with climate change, to thinking about lots of little movements of people within and between countries over short and long periods of time, and the things that move with them, their money, their ideas, their goods and services, and their social networks. If you think about this as a question of mobility and about movement in why people move and the benefits that are conferred with moving, climate change adaptation looks quite differently. So mobility is this idea about people moving and flowing, flows rather than permanent movements. And it's a normal and meaningful social activity that people have been doing for a very long time. And it's a strategy that households use to deal with change, to access different labour markets. There's better jobs there, or there's better pay there, or I can get a job there, or I can get new skills and work there. So people move, and labour markets are a really important influence and driver of mobility. Millions, tens, if not hundreds of millions of people in China are moving from rural areas to cities to access labour markets, to get paid better and get better jobs. People move to access services, to get better schooling, to get access to healthcare, to provide better opportunities for themselves and their children, where they identify those as being in a different location. And people move to manage risk to their income. If livelihoods are not working well in this place, then sending somebody away to earn money to supplement household income through remittances, or in worst case examples, moving whole families, is a strategy that people employ. Movement is a strategy to adapt to change, to seek better opportunities. Now, often that movement isn't permanent. Often it's secular or cyclical or seasonal. And the word that's often used to describe is there's less that people move permanently and more that there's a churn between certain places. And so going back to the idea of Niue, for example, it's not really true to say that the population of Niue is about 1,500 people. The effective population of Niue is more than that. There's always some number of people, hundreds, possibly a couple of thousand, who are not on the island but who are moving, or always intending to return. There's a long-term churn, and so when thinking about population and islands, it's very important to think about that population who may be returning or who may plan to return. And I'll come back to this because it's a very important issue. Mobility in the Pacific Islands is normal. The islands were settled by people who navigated across the ocean on canoes and settled them. There's always been movement between islands. There's well-known pre-colonial trade routes around parts of the northern and eastern islands of Papua New Guinea. There is a well-established Polynesian trade route. There's long history of interaction between Tongans and Fijians. Now you pull up a map of the Pacific and take a look at Tonga and Fiji and think about people navigating between those islands in canoes on a regular basis according to the trade winds and the direction of the currents. It's impressive. And indeed, some of those movements were associated with changing conditions. So Niue was never really on a Polynesian trade route, was never seen as being a particularly desirable destination. Canoes couldn't put in there and easily access water, but it was potentially, or they say, a place where some populations would be sent for various reasons. And also there was a push of people moving around to deal under certain conditions of climatic stress. So this thing about mobility as normal is really important and has important implications for adaptation. In a region where there's actually a lot of mobility, and so a country like the Cook Islands has as many people who identify as Cook Islanders living outside of the Cook Islands as living inside. In Niue, as I've already explained, there are more people born in Niue living away from Niue than there are in Niue. There's a significant population of Samoans living outside of Samoa. They live in the west coast of the United States, in New Zealand and Australia. Tokelau, more people living in New Zealand than there are now in Tokelau, and a significant proportion of Tongans too. So these people identify with the population on islands. Many of them send money back to their families on those islands. They send resources back in times of disasters. They host the children or the parents or elderly people from islands so that they might access school in the more developed economies on the Pacific Rim, or so that they might access better healthcare. They're moving between islands all the time. They're communicating all the time, sharing ideas and information and resources. So the effective population that can be drawn on what look like small isolated islands are actually transnational networks of kin that extend far beyond a single island. And so we can think about the determinants of adaptive capacity and then begin to see that actually these forms of mobility can really significantly enhance adaptive capacity. Remittances are very important. Remittances, money sent home from family members to those living on islands, account for about 15% of the gross domestic product in Kiribati, 15% of all income. About 25% of all income in Samoa, and possibly up to about 40% of income in Tonga. So about 4 out of every $10 potentially that enters Tonga and that becomes available to people in Tonga comes from family members living abroad. It's a really significant resource. And it increases in times of crisis. After disasters, for example, it's known that these networks of kin will send back more money and support people, and this is a well-observed phenomenon in Samoa. Networks of knowledge, and so people who have left and families that have members in more established economies with denser media networks, with better education services, they're more likely to have a relative who's been to university, they're more likely to understand about problems like climate change and its implications for their countries, and certainly have seen many examples of people and met many people in the Pacific who know about climate change because their kids or their cousins told them about it because they learned about it in university. If they didn't have those forms of mobility, they'd be less likely to know and less likely to know what to do about it. Education is very important. Mobility and people in the Pacific Islands, there's very few universities in the region. There's the University of South Pacific in Fiji. There's another university in Fiji now. There's a university in Papua New Guinea that mainly serves people in Papua New Guinea. There's a university in Samoa. But most people now, young people in the Pacific Islands who seek education, leave their villages, leave their islands, and most probably leave their country to seek tertiary education. Increasingly even to seek secondary education. So people have to move to get educated, and education is a good thing and is a really important element that underpins many adaptation activities. Healthcare too. Health services like education services tend to be centralised and more specialised in distant locations. And so being able to move is good for health and good for population health and seeking health services. Leadership is a very important thing. In very small, closed communities, strong leaders and strong institutions can tend to dominate and control ideas and can stifle innovation. And people who have left and returned can often bring back new ideas, and they can talk about new things and challenging things away that don't have repercussions for them. A clear example of this, if it's not exactly a climate change example, is around domestic violence. And so many of the agents advocating for better protection of women and children in domestic settings in the Pacific Islands. The people who are able to walk in and talk about this fearlessly and frankly are people who don't live in those communities, but people who are nevertheless owned by them because they used to live there. And so migrants can be really important change agents. They can bring new ideas. They can come back with different forms of capital, different forms of social and cultural capital that can make very positive effects on change. And insurance, mobility really expands insurance by having family members, by sharing the wealth of a network of kin across different areas. A disaster in one place can be, the effects of that can be being alleviated by resources sent from people living elsewhere. So mobility actually really significantly enhances adaptive capacity and confers all these different sorts of benefits on to climate change adaptation. This is a little island, and if you fly across the Pacific, and this is Niue, which is one of the 9 islands in Tuvalu, you wonder how a couple of hundred people can live on this island in the middle of nowhere. How do they get fuel to run their diesel generators? Where do they get their food from if they're not necessarily growing it locally? How do they do this? How do they afford transport? How do they afford education? Well, here's part of the main reason why. These are cadets at the Maritime Training Institute, which is on Funafuti. These guys train to be seafarers to crew cargo ships, and they then travel the world, and they'll go, once they get their licence, many years crewing ships all around the world. These guys from the equatorial Pacific, growing up on little islands, sitting on massive container ships in a port near you, even if it's freezing cold in the Northern Hemisphere. So they do this because they get to see the world, and they make very good money by Tuvaluan standards. And they send almost all this money home to their families. They come back wealthier, they come back more knowledgeable, they have better skills, and it enhances the wealth and capabilities of their families. So 43% of the male population of Tuvalu has at some point been a seafarer. 43%. To be a seafarer, they only take 60 people into the training college a year, you have to have a certain level of education, have to be healthy, and not have a criminal record. So the desirability of being a seafarer as a form of migration is very positively disciplining on young men. They make about Australian $1,500 a month. They send this home. About 3/4 of all that income is typically sent back to their families. And it supports about 50 to 60% of households in Tuvalu. Their primary form of income is money sent back, or has been money sent back by seafarers. So it's a really, really important way, and that is how people living on very small islands in the middle of the Pacific in Tuvalu pay for their fuel and pay for their rainwater tanks and pay for their transport costs and pay for their education and pay for their imported food through the money that their sons sent home from working around the world on cargo ships. So in a good year, remittances from seafarers account for up to 40% of GDP in Tuvalu. And this is one of those examples where you may recall me saying that if we look at islands through a standard development framework and say they don't have a lot of land and they have small populations and limited economies, how can they possibly develop? Well, they don't develop by using their limited land resources. They develop by using their human resources and by using mobility in really important and innovative ways. And so if we're thinking about building adaptive capacity and thinking about reducing vulnerability to climate change, these are one of these processes. Mobility is one of those important social phenomena that should be built upon to reduce vulnerability to climate change. And though the data is far from conclusive, there's certainly an impression that I have, and I think that others would have, that social vulnerability to climate change within households and within communities and between countries is probably lower in communities and households that have a greater opportunity to move. So those places, and Kiribati would be an example, where there's not a lot of mobility, not a lot of international population movement, tend to be poorer and tend to have higher levels of social vulnerability than those places that have free access to countries like Australia and New Zealand. For example, Cook Islands and Niue, where there's lots of migration, they hold New Zealand passports. They're wealthier, they're better educated, they're healthier, their social vulnerability is lower. And so freeing up mobility and freeing up labour mobility and breaking down some of the barriers to movement the stroke of a pen on an immigration act in Australia or New Zealand or the United States, which costs almost nothing beyond the stroke of a pen on the Immigration Act, could potentially have a far more powerful effect on reducing vulnerability in the Pacific Islands than any aid program or any Copenhagen Climate Fund. There could be, however, more strategic and purposeful processes than that actually thinking about mobility as reducing vulnerability could lead to more targeted and specific policies. It could entail looking at the most isolated, the most socially vulnerable and resource-dependent communities and helping them to overcome barriers to movement. Through support with transport costs, often this is about providing information. Here's how you get here, here's what you do when you get there, here's a job, here's how you get to the doctor, here's how you fill in the visa forms. To help them overcome the barriers to movement, to settle and to work in new places if they choose to do so for fixed periods of time as they might choose, in order to build up their income earning capacity and their human skills and to send money back to households. Training is a really important way of doing this, and matching the deficiencies of skills in developed economies with their labour supply potentially from island countries is a very good idea. This is actually happening. In Australia and New Zealand, getting people to work on farms, picking fruit, for example, is the main activity. It's quite hard. It's hard to get the labour for within Australia, and so there's a pilot scheme now that's exploring bringing people from the Pacific Islands into Australian and New Zealand labour markets to work on farms to pick fruit, pilot seasonal worker scheme. And the evidence of this is showing that it's not as easy as you might think, but where it's successful, people who work on these farms send quite a lot of their money back home, and it has a very positive effect on the places that they come from. A really interesting example is the Kiribati Australian Nursing Initiative, where the Australian government is sponsoring the training of 80 women from Kiribati to become nurses at Griffith University in Queensland. And it's a really smart policy, and it's been very actively supported by the Australian government and the government of Kiribati. Nursing is a highly mobile international labour market. It's fairly standardised. A registered nurse who's trained in Australia can work in most countries around the world. So by training nurses from Kiribati, it's effectively training a whole population of workers who can move globally through the global workforce working in nursing, who are e-Kiribati, who are going to send money back home, expanding these skills and expanding these transnational networks of kin in ways that can really help overcome some of the disadvantages and associated vulnerabilities of living in Kiribati. So going back to this idea about different kinds of adaptation actions, reducing exposure, reducing sensitivity and increasing adaptive capacity, and associated costs and risks, where I've tried to explain that big ticket items, single bullet solutions that seek to reduce exposure may have high costs and high risks of maladaptation, whereas things about building adaptive capacity may not be very expensive and have no regrets. Well, facilitating mobility is cheap. A really powerful, historically proven, tested way of building adaptive capacity that costs very little and it has very few regrets associated with it. Giving people a choice to move. Just a choice to move. To take or use as they see fit, helping them to move potentially by providing them with skills and various forms of training, to exercise if they see fit, can really boost adaptive capacity, has no regrets. Not doing adaptation to people, letting them do it to themselves if they want, in ways that are going to improve their lives, in ways that suit them. Cost nothing, no regrets, very powerful way of reducing vulnerability to climate change. So if we shift our thinking from thinking about climate change forcing migration and forced resettlement to thinking about everyday practices of mobility, we begin to look at this climate change and human movement question really quite differently, and seeing it not as a threat, but as a really powerful opportunity. Mobility is a proven, effective, cheap and very fair way of facilitating adaptation to climate change.